I took the job because I needed somewhere quiet. That's the simplest way to explain it. A year earlier, my marriage had ended. There wasn't a dramatic reason. No affair. No screaming matches. Just years of small disappointments stacked on top of each other until there was more distance than connection. After the divorce, silence became something I noticed everywhere. In my apartment, in grocery stores, in the empty passenger seat of my truck. I started volunteering for longer assignments at work because being busy felt easier than sitting alone. That's how I ended up maintaining avalanche monitoring stations in the northern mountains. The State Transportation Department operated dozens of remote sensor sites along seasonal passes. Most people never saw them. Small clusters of equipment, solar panels, weather instruments, snow depth sensors, communication towers, everything designed to warn road crews about dangerous conditions. My job was straightforward. Drive between sites, inspect equipment, replace damaged parts, check batteries, verify data transmissions, document everything. The winter roads were closed for most civilian traffic, which meant entire sections of mountain wilderness became nearly empty. Weeks could pass without seeing another vehicle. For some people, that sounded miserable. For me, it sounded perfect. The assignment started in late October. The first snow hadn't arrived yet. The mountains were cold, but mostly bare. Gray rock, dark pine forests, thin patches of old snow hiding in shadows. My base station sat near an abandoned maintenance yard almost 40 miles from the nearest town. There were two buildings, a workshop and a bunkhouse. The bunkhouse contained 6 rooms, even though only 2 were occupied. Mine, and a senior technician named Greg. Greg had worked the mountain routes for almost 20 years. He was the kind of man who seemed permanently tired. Not unhappy, just tired, like he'd spent decades waking up before sunrise. The first week was ordinary. Equipment inspections, paperwork, vehicle checks. Nothing unusual. The anomaly appeared on a Tuesday. I remember because I was reviewing transmission logs after dinner. Each monitoring station reported weather information every 15 minutes. Wind, temperature, snowpack measurements, battery status, signal strength, routine data. One station reported something different, a field I had never seen before. Observer present, the value underneath read. Yes, I assumed it was a software error. Sensor glitches happened. Communication systems occasionally generated nonsense. I made a note to inspect the station the next day. The location was designated Station 14B, a remote ridge overlooking a closed mountain pass. Getting there required nearly 2 hours of driving and another mile of hiking. Everything looked normal. The equipment functioned correctly. Solar panels were clean. Power systems were healthy. No signs of vandalism. No footprints. No vehicles. No evidence anyone had been there. I reset the system and returned to base. That night, the transmission appeared again. Observer present. Yes, this time I checked historical logs. The field didn't exist, at least not officially. There was no observer present category anywhere in the system documentation. No reference manuals. No maintenance notes. Nothing. I deleted the entry. The next report generated it again. Observer present. Yes. I showed Greg the following morning. He stared at the screen for several seconds, longer than I expected. Then he shrugged. Bad firmware. That was all he said. I asked whether he'd seen it before. He took a sip of coffee. Maybe. Not yes. Not no. Just maybe. The answer bothered me. Over the next week, the same field appeared from multiple stations. Always the same wording. Always the same answer. Yes. I searched employee records. No Daniel Hart. No former technician. No contractor. No state employee. Nothing. The name existed only inside those transmission archives. I expected the mystery to end there. Instead, it expanded. 2 days later, another name appeared. Elena March. Different station. Different timestamp. Same unexplained category. I searched again. Nothing. No employee. No contractor. No record. The names felt invented. Random. Meaningless. Until I started noticing something uncomfortable. They accumulated. Week after week. New names. New entries. Always attached to remote stations. Never attached to locations near town. Always the isolated sites. The forgotten ones. I created a spreadsheet, mostly because I was bored, partly because curiosity had gotten hold of me. 32 names appeared over 6 weeks. Everyone untraceable. Everyone supposedly present at locations where nobody should have been. Then one afternoon, I visited Station 22A. The weather had turned ugly. Low clouds, freezing rain, visibility barely a few hundred feet. I finished replacing a damaged sensor and returned to my truck. A clipboard rested on the passenger seat. At first I assumed Greg had left it there. Then I realized I'd locked the truck. The clipboard contained a maintenance checklist. Fresh handwriting, fresh signatures, completed only hours earlier. Signed by Daniel Hart, the non-existent employee. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time staring at that signature. The ink looked real. The paper looked aged. Not old. Used. As though it had traveled through years of routine filing. When I brought it back to base, Greg looked genuinely uncomfortable. That was the first time I saw his expression change. He didn't examine the document. Didn't ask questions. He simply said, "Throw it away." I asked why. He repeated himself. "Throw it away." That night I didn't. Instead I scanned it. Saved copies. Photographed every page. The next morning the original document was gone. Not misplaced. Gone. My room remained locked. The scan survived. The paper disappeared. That should have been enough for me to request reassignment. Instead I became obsessed. The deeper I dug, the stranger the records became. Names appearing in transmission logs eventually appeared elsewhere. Vehicle schedules, maintenance requests, supply orders, email chains. Slowly, gradually, the deeper I dug, the stranger the records became. Names appearing in transmission logs eventually appeared elsewhere. Vehicle schedules, maintenance requests, supply orders, email chains. Slowly, gradually, as if the system was constructing employment histories around people who had never existed. The process took months. The names gained depth. Addresses, personnel numbers, emergency contacts, training, certifications, entire careers. And once those records existed long enough, people began remembering them. That's the part that still frightens me most. Not the impossible documents, the memories. A dispatcher mentioned Daniel during a conference call, casually, like he'd worked there for years. Another employee referenced Elena while discussing equipment repairs. Nobody questioned it. Nobody hesitated. I started asking direct questions. The responses varied. Some people remember them clearly. Others didn't recognize the names. The percentage shifted over time. More recognition, less confusion, like watching reality reach a consensus. Then one evening, I searched Daniel Hart again. This time results appeared. Personnel files, archive reports, performance reviews, everything. The system had finished building him, and everyone except me seemed convinced he'd always existed. That's when I discovered something worse. A new name appeared in the transmission logs. Michael Reeves. My name. The category wasn't observer present. It wasn't additional personnel logged. It simply read, pending integration. I wish I could explain what that meant. I can't. I only know what happened afterward. The records began describing things I hadn't done. Site inspections, equipment repairs, travel logs, future dates, future signatures. Every week, more entries appeared. And eventually, I found reports documenting conversations that hadn't happened yet. Word for word. Some occurred exactly as written days later. Others never happened. At least I don't think they did. That uncertainty became the worst part. Because after a while, I stopped trusting my memory. Stopped trusting paperwork. Stopped trusting people. I resigned 6 months later. Officially for stress. Unofficially because I was terrified. The transportation department accepted my resignation without questions. Too easily. As though departures happened regularly. As though they expected them. I moved 3 states away. Different job. Different apartment. Different life. For a while I convinced myself the mountains had simply broken something in my head. Isolation can do that. Long periods alone. Repetitive routines. Bad sleep. I wanted a rational explanation. Then last month, an envelope arrived. No return address. No postage marks. Inside was a maintenance report. Current year. Current date. Signed with my name. Documenting work at Station 14B, the station I haven't visited in over 2 years. At the bottom was a personnel roster. Most of the names were familiar. Daniel Hart, Elena March, others I'd tracked long ago. One final name appeared beneath them, a name I didn't recognize. At least not then. 3 days later, I met that person at work. A new employee, recently hired. Everyone acted as though he'd been there for months. Nobody remembered when he started. Nobody remembered who trained him. When I introduced myself, he smiled politely. Then he asked a question. A simple question. One that sounded completely harmless. Are the mountain stations still reporting observer activity? I never answered. I left the room. I left work early. And that night, I opened the old archive files I'd promised myself never to read again. The newest transmission had arrived only hours earlier. Observer present. Yes. Pending integration. Yes. The location field was blank. For the first time since the system began, no mountain station was listed. Only coordinates. Coordinates that pointed directly to my apartment building. The envelope arrived again 6 days later. Same plain white paper. Same lack of postage. No return address. No indication it had traveled through any mail system. This time there were 3 pages. The first was a maintenance log. The second was a personnel roster. The third was something new. An occupancy report. At the top, beneath a state transportation logo that no longer matched the department's current branding, was my apartment address. The report listed residents. Apartment 1A, Apartment 1B, Apartment 2A, Apartment 2B. Names, move-in dates, vehicle information, emergency contacts. Everything looked normal until I reached my own unit. Apartment 3C, resident, Michael Reeves. Occupancy status, observed. That word sat there alone. Not active, not verified, not current. Observed. I stared at it for a long time. The report wasn't threatening. Nothing about it felt intentionally hostile. It looked administrative, routine, the kind of paperwork nobody reads carefully. That somehow made it worse. Because whoever or whatever was producing these documents wasn't trying to scare me. It was documenting me. The same way a weather station documented snowfall. The same way a sensor documented temperature. A fact being recorded. Nothing more. Nothing less. I called Greg that night. I hadn't spoken to him in almost a year. The number still worked. He answered on the 4th ring. No greeting. No introduction. Just silence. Then, you got another envelope. Not a question. A statement. My stomach tightened. I asked how he knew. Another pause. Then a slow exhale. I got mine too. Mine. Not his. Mine. As if the envelopes belonged to specific people. As if they were expected. I asked him what was happening. For several seconds, all I heard was static. Then he asked something strange. How many names do you recognize now? I didn't answer immediately, because I understood what he meant. Years earlier, the names had been strangers. Daniel Hart, Elena March, others. Now many of them felt familiar. Not because I knew them, because I felt like I should know them. Like distant coworkers I'd met dozens of times. Like people whose names belonged in memory, even when no actual memory existed. I admitted that. Greg sighed. A tired sound. The sound of someone confirming a fear. That's how it starts. I asked him if the names were real. His answer still bothers me. They become real. Then he hung up. I called back twice. No answer. The next morning, I drove to work exhausted. Rain covered the roads. Gray skies. Cold wind. The kind of weather that made everything feel older. At lunch, I found myself watching people. Co-workers. Delivery drivers. Reception staff. Trying to identify who belonged and who didn't. It sounds irrational. I know how that sounds. But after enough exposure to impossible records, you start looking for inconsistencies. The new employee was there. The man whose name had appeared in the roster before I met him. He sat in a break room, drinking coffee, reading something on his phone. Perfectly ordinary. Nothing unusual about him. Except nobody could explain where he'd come from. I started asking careful questions. Not obvious questions. Normal ones. How long had he worked here? Who hired him? What department was he assigned to? The answers never matched. One supervisor said 6 months. Another said 3 weeks. Someone else thought he transferred from another office. Human resources couldn't immediately locate his onboarding file. But nobody found that strange. They simply assumed someone else had it. The inconsistency should have raised concerns. Instead, it slid past everyone, like water finding a crack. That afternoon, I searched internal databases. His personnel record existed. Training, certifications, tax forms, employment history, everything. The file was complete. Too complete. Perfectly organized. Without errors. Without gaps. Almost every real employee file contains mistakes. Missing documents. Old addresses. Incorrect phone numbers. His didn't. It looked assembled rather than accumulated. I printed a copy. The printer jammed. When I cleared the paper tray, the document was gone. Not shredded. Not damaged. Gone. The printer had produced blank pages instead. I didn't tell anyone. I stopped talking about the issue entirely, because every attempt to investigate seemed to strengthen whatever process was occurring. And yet I couldn't stop watching. Over the following weeks, more names appeared in my life. Not through envelopes. Through ordinary encounters. People introduced to me by friends. Temporary workers. Neighbors. Employees. Individuals who felt strangely established despite having uncertain histories. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every name appeared in a transmission log first, then documentation, then social reality. The order never changed. Records, acceptance, memory, existence. One night, I opened the archive files again. I had copied thousands of old reports before leaving the mountains. Most were mundane. Weather measurements, battery checks, equipment maintenance. But hidden among them were years of unexplained entries. Names. Hundreds of names. Far more than I remembered. Some repeated for decades. Others appeared briefly and vanished. I began comparing them against public records, voter registrations, property databases, professional licenses. The results turned my blood cold, because many of those people existed now. Not all, but enough. Individuals with documented histories stretching backward through years they apparently hadn't occupied until after appearing in the network. It was impossible, yet the evidence sat in front of me. One name first appeared in a sensor log from 2009. No trace of the person existed before 2016. After 2016, they possessed a complete life history. School records, employment history, addresses, everything. Reality had filled in the missing years. Or something had. I stopped sleeping well. I started checking locks repeatedly, reading the same emails multiple times, losing track of conversations. At first, I blamed anxiety. Then something happened that removed all doubt. My sister called. We weren't especially close anymore. Not after the divorce. Not after years of drifting apart. But we still spoke occasionally. Halfway through the conversation, she mentioned someone named Daniel. I froze. I asked which Daniel. The one you worked with in the mountains. My throat went dry. I asked how she knew that name. She sounded confused. Because according to her, she'd met Daniel years ago. At a family barbecue. We'd supposedly talked about him repeatedly. She remembered details. Stories. Conversations. Shared experiences. None of them had happened. Yet she recalled them with complete confidence. I ended the call shortly afterward. Then I sat alone in my apartment for nearly an hour, trying to determine whether my memory was failing, whether hers was, whether both were. The uncertainty became unbearable. That was the real horror, not knowing which version of reality was being altered. The documents, the people, or me. 3 months later, Greg disappeared. I learned about it through a former co-worker. No obituary, no public notice. He simply stopped showing up. His house was sold. His accounts closed. His records thinned. Not erased. Reduced. Like a photograph losing resolution. When I searched for him online, fewer results appeared every week. The process felt familiar. Not deletion. Replacement. The system wasn't removing people. It was making room. A final envelope arrived last winter. Larger than the others. Inside was a stack of reports nearly an inch thick. Years of future records, future maintenance logs, future personnel assignments, future occupancy reports, and on every page my name appeared. Not as a resident, not as an employee, not as an observer. The designation had changed. Network asset. I read hundreds of pages that night. Many described events that hadn't happened. Some described conversations I would later experience almost word for word. Others remain in the future, even now, waiting. The last page contained no dates, no signatures, no location information, only a roster, dozens of names, some familiar, some not. At the very bottom was a category, observer present. The answer beneath it read, yes. Then another line, observer count. For years that field had remained empty. This time it contained a number. I remember it perfectly because I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. The number wasn't 1. It wasn't 10. It wasn't 100. It was increasing. The document had captured it mid-update, as though whatever system generated the reports had produced the page before finishing the calculation. The final digit had been partially overwritten several times, growing, changing, climbing. And that's why I'm posting this. Not because I think I can stop it. Not because I think anyone will believe me. But because the mountain stations were never measuring snow. Not really. The weather data was real. The equipment was real. The roads were real. But those things weren't the primary purpose. They were observation points, collection points, places where something recorded human presence the same way a scientist records temperature readings. I don't know what happens when a name completes the process. I don't know where Greg went. I don't know whether Daniel Hart was ever a real person. What I know is this. 3 nights ago, I received another occupancy report. Not for my apartment. For this website. The report listed usernames, post dates, activity records. It looked exactly like the reports from the Mountain Network. Exactly. And at the bottom of the page was a familiar field. Observer present. Yes, observer count, still increasing.